are not living, but are able to replicate themselves in the context of the cell. I want to suggest that any issue about minimal complexity has to look very strongly at this. For example, 30 years ago, the debate about the origins of life took some very interesting turns surrounding around whether or not things that could not form otherwise could form on a clay substrate. Now, I don't want to debate that theory. We aren't anymore considering it. But what is really important in posing a problem is to make sure you put the boundaries in the right place. And very often, order can come from the surroundings, even when it cannot come from the thing itself. How many more minutes do I have? I have 9 minutes left. Okay. What I want to argue is that if we look at the history of evolutionary theory, we find a history of very responsible dealing with paradox and open-minded research, usually. We are human beings after all, so we're a little fallible in our own ways. Open-minded research dealing with opening new problems. If I can call it up, I'm going to go back to a thing in the history of intelligent design, or actually it's what used to be called natural theology. This is a page from a work published in 1731 to 1735 called the Kupferbibel. It was a 5-volume illustrated Bible published in Augsburg, and it was full of natural history. And the idea was of natural theology that you should study nature to learn more about the Creator. Now, at this time, this was now roughly 130 years before Darwin, there were no other options to explain design, at least design that people had not done. Now, this figure is actually quite interesting. There's another one, I don't put it up, of the eye. Paley wasn't the first to think of that. There had been a tradition of these. This is interesting because it depicts social insects. And on the left, we find the holes in the wood characteristic of termites, and that's a termite up there. And on the right, we find the boards in the wood of carpenter ants. And if you look down there, there's a reference to Proverbs chapter 6, verse 8. And you go chase down and it says, "Look thou, a sluggard, to the ant, learn from the wisdom of her ways." This is a moral homily that said basically, do what your caste tells you and work hard and so on. It was something that it was an attempt to derive a lesson from the natural world for individuals. We don't do that anymore. We don't try to derive ethics from biological regularities. Although, in a period when you thought you had a creator constructing all of nature, that was something that they did. Now, I bring this up because actually, some of you may have known, Darwin published an essay, or didn't publish an essay, but wrote an essay of The Origin of Species in 1842, and left word that it'd be published if he died. He thought it was a sketch. He thought this was enough to get the theory out and so on, but he wasn't ready. Bob Richards, my colleague in Chicago, looked at this and looked at some of Darwin's writings on it. And it turned out he included a note with this that said, I just don't know what to do about the social insects. Why should that be important? Because the social insects were a paradigm of natural theology. Darwin had to worry about the social insects at least as much as he had to worry about the Paley. And what happened then, shortly before he published The Origin, Bob argues, in 1858, he hit upon an explanation for it. Well, what was the problem with the social insects? The problem with the social insects is the queen reproduces and produces a lot of sterile males. Different male cast at work. But the sterile males don't leave any offspring. And yet everything in Darwin's theory said, well, you have to have heritable offspring heritable traits going into your offspring and so on. So if you had this design without offspring, how could it be explained on Darwin's theory? And Darwin realized in 1858 that if he took the whole colony as a unit, notice bringing in more of the context, he could invoke colony selection to explain the evolution of sterile cats. And with that, he felt he had solved his problem. And also, it was the first paper really in group selection. And Darwin went ahead and published.